There is a very specific feeling that flows through the body when something fundamental is about to break, not to be destroyed, but to release what has been held back for too long. Perhaps in the last hours you felt a sudden fear, a pressure in your chest that has no logical explanation, or an abrupt awakening in the middle of the night without apparent reason. It is important to understand that what is being perceived now is not an illusion and not the product of a mind that cannot let go. What is happening right now is a resonance. A boundary has already been reached. The energy knows it, the universe knows it. And that is why this message comes today, precisely in this moment, when doubt began to weigh heavier than necessary. In this video, it will be understood with absolute clarity what will change drastically, why the persistent silence was never a synonym for abandonment, and what kind of energetic decision is now moving on levels that the eye cannot perceive. Because even if it has not been spoken out loud, there exists within you a deep fatigue, an exhaustion that does not come from lack of sleep, but from waiting, from giving affection without clear answers, from the feeling that time stood still exactly when a sign was needed most. And yet, being present in this place is no coincidence. Continuing to search for answers to understand why this story does not end, even though it hurts, obeys a higher purpose. It is necessary to speak with the rawest and most direct truth. This person cannot bear it anymore. The structure of indifference and distance that was built to maintain control has begun to collapse under its own weight. There are connections that do not simply break because one side decides to run away, because they were not born only from human desire, but from a purpose of evolution that exceeds the will of the ego. When life unites two consciousnesses that are meant to evolve together, the path can become complex, full of obstacles and silence, but it never becomes meaningless. Even silence has its own language, a frequency that causes profound changes that are not visible right now but will soon be understood. The urgency of this message lies in the fact that the situation has reached a point of no return. This person has also reached their limit. The emotional exhaustion is not one-sided, it is mutual, even if it appears radically different in the eyes of the world. While on this side the uncertainty is processed through introspection or the search for spiritual answers, the other side struggles in a deafening silence. While doubt arises here about whether it was worth it, involuntary memories begin to appear there, memories that can no longer be suppressed. And although the external appearance suggests that someone has moved on and left everything behind, on the energetic level both sides are being worked on with the same intensity and at the same time. Life does not allow a true connection to dissolve without first leading it to the exact point where the heart can no longer maintain the old ways of acting. Sometimes reaching the limit does not mean the end of the story, but the precise place where something new, more authentic, and less fearful takes shape. Perhaps the recurring question was why everything suddenly became so difficult. Why what once flowed naturally now hurts? Or why this person distanced themselves just when it seemed everything would fit perfectly? The answer that the ego fears but the soul must hear is that there was no real rejection but an inevitable phase of preparation. True love is not built only with the emotion of the beginning, but with the maturity granted through devotion and truth. There were dynamics that could not continue as they were. There were behaviors that needed to break, deep fears that needed to come to light, and emotional dependencies that could not enter the new phase that destiny has prepared. The universe does not give what one is not ready to hold. And when the heart feels it cannot go on, when the mind becomes tired of understanding strategies and the soul asks only for peace, that is where the energy acts with the greatest clarity, not because surrender was seen, but because one has reached as far as humanly possible. This story did not stop because of a lack of love. It is being redefined. And this redefinition involves decisions that this person is now making not out of impulse, but due to an intervention of destiny that no longer allows them to continue deceiving themselves. But to understand why this collapse is happening today, we must look at what has happened behind the mask of indifference, in that private space to which no one else has access. If you are ready to integrate this teaching into your life, write in the comments, "I trust what is coming." It is fascinating and at the same time painful to observe how a person tries to deceive themselves when faced with an emotion that overwhelms them. Right now, if we could observe this person's reality without filters, we would see a very different scene from the one that fear-based imagination usually projects. There is the mistaken assumption that silence is equivalent to forgetting, or that physical distance is synonymous with inner peace. Nothing could be further from the truth. The person who occupies your thoughts is not at peace. Although they try to project an image of distance, coldness, or even total indifference, an internal conflict rages inside them that they can no longer ignore. For a long time, this person tried to maintain a prefabricated normality. They get up, fulfill their duties, interact with their environment, and smile when appropriate. But there is a crack in this facade. The fatigue that was first felt on this side is now reflected there, not as guilt, but as brutal awareness. They are beginning to understand what was lost, what was avoided out of cowardice, and what could not be held at the right moment. Life allows emptiness to speak when words are not enough, and this emptiness has become unbearably uncomfortable for those who flee. They have tried to fill this space with all kinds of distractions, perhaps excessive work, perhaps new, superficial friendships, or simply the constant noise of technology to avoid hearing their own thoughts. But none of this works anymore. The emptiness is no longer filled with distractions, not with other people, not with logical excuses, because when a connection comes from the soul, nothing superficial can replace it. One can try to deceive the mind for a while, to rationalize the escape, to say it was for the best or that it was not the right moment, but one cannot deceive the heart indefinitely. Here a devastating psychological phenomenon comes into play for those who try to forget: the failure of substitutes. Every time this person tries to connect with someone else or find refuge in activities that once brought joy, they encounter an invisible wall. Everything tastes bland. Conversations with others feel empty. Laughter sounds forced, and intimacy feels mechanical. This happens because she experienced a different depth with you, and once the soul has experienced this kind of recognition, it does not settle for less. At some point you may have wondered whether your intensity was excessive, whether you felt too much, or whether you loved more than necessary. But the absolute truth is that you did not love too much. You loved from the right place. The problem was not the intensity of what you offered. It was the timing discrepancy between two different inner processes. One was ready to go deeper, and the other was still learning to face what they feel. This learning that the other side goes through is usually painful because it means looking one's own wounds directly in the face, the repeated patterns and the fear-based decisions. No one changes as long as everything is comfortable. Transformation arises only when the current situation is painful enough not to want to repeat it. That is why the silence dragged on for so long. It was not a punishment designed to make you suffer, but it acted as a merciless mirror, a space in which each person had to see themselves without the influence of the other, where absence spoke louder than any discussion, and where the question was no longer, "What has the other done?" but "What have I done with what I felt?" Now the memories return with renewed force, almost violently. Simple moments that once seemed like small, unimportant details today weigh more on this person's awareness than any empty promise. because when the soul recognizes its counterpart, it does not forget. The mind can try to block, to rationalize, and to flee in every direction, but it cannot erase the energetic imprint that has been engraved. This person reaches a point of inner surrender. They may not yet express it in words, but they live it in every moment of solitude. There are sleepless nights that have become a habit, repetitive thoughts circling in loops at 3 or 4 in the morning, a feeling of being incomplete even when everything in their outer life seems to function normally. This discomfort does not come to destroy the person, it comes to awaken them. The universe does not push aggressively, but it also does not allow an essential truth to sleep forever. When the right time approaches, circumstances adjust so that the heart has no escape left. And that is exactly what is happening now behind the scenes. Perhaps an external sign was expected, a message or a clear action, but before that happens, in the physical world, the change always takes place inside first, because no true action arises without a prior inner transformation. What does not change inside cannot stand outside. A decision is forming in this person's mind, a decision that is neither rushed nor impulsive. It is a resolve that comes after extreme exhaustion, after understanding that running away no longer works, and that distance has not served to erase the feeling, but to ignite it. And this decision is based not only on the desire to see someone again, but on a deep recognition of reality, to acknowledge that this connection was not accidental, that there was something sacred even in the midst of pain and confusion. However, this suffering is not a random punishment or a free torture from destiny. There is a deep psychological reason behind all this erratic behavior, an old defense mechanism that has operated from the shadows and is now on the verge of being deactivated. To understand why someone would run from what they desire most, it is necessary to understand the fear of one's own light and how your presence acted as a catalyst that unintentionally triggered all the alarms of their ego. To truly understand why this person pulled away at the moment of greatest connection, it is necessary to delve into one of the greatest mysteries of human psychology. There is a painful paradox that often confuses those who give their heart with honesty. Why would someone run from exactly what they claim to desire? The answer does not lie in a lack of love, but in the fear of one's own truth. Often one thinks that rejection is an act directed at the other person, a sign of disinterest or incompatibility, but the reality is much more complex and deeper. One does not flee from the one they love, they flee from what that person reflects. You were not simply a partner or a romantic interest. You were and still are a high-resolution mirror. And when a mirror is too clear, sometimes the image it reflects is frightening for those who are not ready to see their own face without masks. The renowned psychiatrist Carl Jung dedicated much of his life to explaining this phenomenon through the concept of the shadow. Jung taught us that all human beings carry an invisible bag in which they hide all the parts of themselves they do not want to acknowledge, their fears, their insecurities, their unresolved traumas, and the childhood wounds that still fester. However, the shadow does not contain only darkness. There is also what is known as the golden shadow, which houses the unexplored potential, the unclaimed light, and the ability to love deeply that the person has suppressed out of fear of vulnerability. When this person met you, your presence acted as a powerful spotlight that illuminated both sides of their shadow at the same time. On one hand, your ability to love unconditionally and your willingness to surrender emotionally illuminated their own shortcomings. When they saw your courage to open your heart, this person was forced to face their own cowardice. When they felt the purity of your intentions, they felt the weight of their own past mistakes and the guilt of not being enough. This creates a devastating inner conflict. The ego, that part of the mind that tries to protect itself and maintain control at any cost, panics. The ego whispers to them that they do not deserve this love, that they will eventually be exposed as an imposter, or that if they fully surrender, they will lose their freedom and identity. In this state of irrational fear, the instinctive reaction is not to come closer, but to create distance, to turn off the spotlight and return to the safety of semi-darkness. On the other hand, there is the terror of the golden shadow. It may sound strange, but sometimes one's own light is more frightening than darkness. Your presence showed this person who they could become. You showed them a higher, more loving and more complete version of themselves. But becoming that better version requires work, requires breaking old structures, leaving behind toxic habits and maturing. And human beings are naturally extremely resistant to change, even when that change is positive. This person felt that they had to transform themselves in order to be on your level. And in that moment, the task seemed titanic, almost impossible. The escape was a desperate attempt to return to the comfort zone where no evolution was demanded of them, where they could continue being the small and limited version of themselves without anyone reminding them of their wasted potential. It is essential to understand that this process almost always takes place on an unconscious level. This person did not wake up one day and rationally decide that your love was too valuable to accept. What they experienced was a diffuse fear, a feeling of suffocation, or an inexplicable need for space. They projected their shadow onto you. Instead of admitting, "I am afraid of not being enough," their mind translated this fear into thoughts like, "This person is too intense, I'm not ready for this," or "I need to find myself." Blaming the connection or looking for faults in you was the simplest defense mechanism to avoid looking inward. It is much easier to believe that the other person is the problem than to admit that the problem is one's own inability to maintain intimacy. Carl Jung said that what is not made conscious manifests in life as fate. As long as this person keeps this shadow in the dark, they will continue repeating the same cycles of escape and pain. However, and here lies the hope of this message, the human psyche has a natural mandate toward wholeness. One cannot flee from their own shadow forever because the shadow is an intrinsic part of being. The more one tries to suppress an emotion or a truth, the more force it accumulates in the unconscious. It is like trying to hold an inflatable ball underwater. You can hold it down for a while with effort, but eventually the pressure will cause it to shoot to the surface with unstoppable force. What happened during this time of silence and separation is exactly this build-up of pressure. By distancing themselves from you, this person thought they would find peace, but they found emptiness. And in this emptiness, the shadow began to speak. Without your outer light illuminating their wounds, they had to remain alone with them in the darkness. The avoidance strategy failed. The mirror that you represented did not disappear with physical distance because the mirror is now internalized in their memory. Every time they try to connect with someone else and feel the superficiality of the encounter, they remember the depth they had with you. Every time they face a crisis and do not have your support, they remember the safety your presence offered them. The comparison is inevitable and painful. The fear of wholeness, this terror of losing control, of falling in love, now transforms into a greater fear. The fear of losing the chance at happiness. The rigid structure of the ego begins to crack. This person begins to understand that the control they so fiercely protected was in reality a cage. The solitude that initially seemed like a safe refuge has become a cold prison, and the freedom they believed they would gain by pulling away now feels like an involuntary exile. The psyche seeks balance and pushes this person toward integration. They can no longer pretend that this part of their life does not exist, nor can they continue denying that they abandoned themselves when they fled from you. This is the process of individuation spoken of in depth psychology, but lived through the fire of a soul connection. It is not an intellectual path, it is a visceral experience. This person is learning violently that real love cannot be killed, it can only have its acceptance delayed, and delaying it hurts. It hurts physically, it hurts in the soul. The resistance requires an immense amount of energy. Pretending it does not matter, suppressing the urge to call, silencing the intuition that screams your name. All of that consumes vital resources, and this person is exhausted. Their ego is losing the battle against their own soul. The shadow, once seen as a monster that had to be hidden, is now demanding its place at the table. The defenses fall because there is no strength left to maintain them. And when the ego's defenses fall, the truth emerges unfiltered. This person begins to see that you were not the enemy, not the threat, not the source of their fear. You were the invitation to grow, and the fear they felt was not of you, but of the immensity of what you could create together. The perspective shifts radically. What once seemed like an unacceptable risk now appears as the only possible salvation from a grey and meaningless life. The initial rejection was a survival act of an immature ego. But the ego cannot survive forever against the commands of the heart. The inner battle between the fear of suffering and the desire to love reaches its final resolution. This person finds themselves at a definitive crossroads, to continue protecting themselves and wither in loneliness, or to risk feeling and blooming, even if that means losing control. And the scales are tilting slowly but irresistibly towards surrender. Not surrender to you as if you were an opponent, but surrender to love as a transformative force. And right here, in the midst of this silent and bitter inner battle between the ego that wants safety and the soul that demands expansion, a fundamental shift has occurred in the energy that connects you both. A turn that explains why suddenly everything feels different. Everything in this universe functions according to unchanging laws of balance and compensation. What happens in the deep mind and shadow of this person does not remain isolated in their head. It sends out a frequency, a specific vibration, that travels and directly affects the shared reality between you both. Here, the most decisive and tangible phenomenon of this current phase comes into play. The radical change in energetic polarity. To understand it, one must look honestly at the recent history. For a long time, the invisible dynamic between you followed a classic pattern of pursuit and resistance. Perhaps without conscious intention, driven by fear and a legitimate dread of loss, you sent a massive amount of energy in that direction. There were messages, there was the search for answers, or there simply existed an obsessive and constant thought directed at their being. On the subtle level, this is perceived as physical pressure, like an unceasing wave pushing against a closed door. According to fundamental physical law, when a force pushes, the natural reaction of the body receiving that impact is to tense up, to resist, and to retreat in order to maintain its own balance. While you moved forward energetically, the other side instinctively withdrew. While you asked for clarity, the other side built walls of confusion. It was an exhausting and painful dance in which the roles seemed fixed and condemned to repeat themselves forever. However, something fundamental has changed recently. You have changed. Perhaps it was the result of extreme fatigue, an awakening of your own dignity, or a higher spiritual understanding. But the fact is that you stopped pushing. You began to withdraw your energy from the equation. There is no longer that desperate vigilance over their movements. No more signals are being sent seeking external validation. and your thoughts, although they still return to the memory of the connection, no longer carry that tortured plea from before. You have begun to focus on your own axis, to inhabit your own life, and to prioritize your own healing. This act, which at first glance might seem like a sad resignation or a defense mechanism, has in fact triggered an absolute earthquake in the energetic system of the other person. By withdrawing the pressure, you created what is known as a magnetic vacuum. Nature and energy abhor a vacuum. They always seek to fill it. When you stopped occupying the entire energetic space with your presence and insistence, an abyss of silence opened around this person. At first, this silence might have felt like relief to their ego, a false sense of victory or freedom. But this phase lasts very briefly. Quickly, the absence of your energy begins to feel not like freedom, but like coldness. This person had become, without knowing it, accustomed to feeding on your constant attention. Your energy was the fuel that kept their sense of importance and security inflated. By cutting off this supply, the other side was exposed to the emotional weather. Now a fascinating phenomenon occurs. Since they no longer feel you behind them, this person feels the irresistible impulse to look back. The law of the energetic rubber band has been activated. The more you withdraw to your center, the stronger the attraction the other side feels toward you. Now, in this precise moment of silence, they truly begin to miss you. Before, they couldn't miss you because your energetic presence was omnipresent. There was no room for nostalgia. But now, with real distance existing, memory has room to land and take root. And it is not an intellectual memory. It is a physical feeling of loss. This person begins to feel that something vital is missing, an essential piece of their inner structure that has disappeared. This shift in polarity brings an unexpected consequence for those who fled: the weight of memory. Before, when you maintained the connection with your effort, you also carried the emotional load of the relationship. You were the one who processed the emotions, who suffered through doubts, who kept the flame alive. By letting go, you dropped this weight, and this weight does not disappear. It is simply transferred. Now it is the other person who must carry the entirety of the emotional connection. Suddenly, the memories they could previously ignore become intrusive and heavy. The emotions they suppressed fall upon them all at once, without you there to soften the impact. This is why the indifference this person once displayed begins to crumble. They can no longer maintain the attitude of someone who cares about nothing, because now they feel everything with intensified force. They feel your absence like a ghostly presence that follows them everywhere. At work, on the street, in the solitude of their room, your energy paradoxically surrounds them now that you no longer insist. It is the irony of the universe. By letting go, you bound. By stopping your pursuit, you began to attract. The energy you once used to try to break down their walls is now used to build your own stability, and that makes you irresistibly magnetic. This person perceives that your staying is no longer guaranteed under their control, that your life continues, that your light shines without their permission, and this frightens them. The fear of losing you forever has replaced the fear of commitment. This energetic shift is real and tangible. This person now stands at a point where withdrawal brings no relief. The inner tension grows with each day in which nothing is said, with each moment in which the impulse to act is suppressed. What once seemed like self-protection now feels like self-betrayal. The inner voice, long ignored, is no longer quiet. It demands honesty, consistency, and movement. Hesitation now costs more energy than the courage to show oneself. And precisely because of this, the inner pressure becomes unstoppable, not out of weakness, but because the truth can no longer remain locked inside without causing harm. What follows now is not an impulsive step, but a necessary action. one that arises from clarity, not fear. This story is heading toward a moment in which silence no longer makes sense and distance has lost its function. Whether the words will be perfect no longer matters. What matters is only that they are spoken, because what is real demands expression, and what is connected eventually finds its way back to each other. Here the waiting ends, not because someone pushed, but because the inner truth demands its place.